The winter of 1941 descended upon the Soviet Union with a brutality that matched the advancing Wehrmacht divisions cutting through the western territories of Stalin's empire. As temperatures plummeted to minus 40 degrees Celsius in some regions, and the German blockade tightened around Leningrad, millions of Soviet citizens faced a challenge that would define their existence for generations to come. Survival through the harshest winters on Earth, with dwindling food supplies and collapsing distribution networks. What they ate during those dark months reveals not just culinary adaptation, but the raw mechanics of human endurance under totalitarian systems, wartime deprivation, and climatic extremes that would have broken lesser societies. The foods that sustained the Soviet people through winter were not chosen for pleasure or nutrition in the conventional sense, but for availability, storability, and the simple mathematics of caloric survival. Black bread stood as the cornerstone of Soviet winter survival. But this was not bread, as Western Europe understood it. The dark, dense loaves that emerged from Soviet bakeries contained rye flour mixed with whatever grain substitutes the state could procure, often bulked out with sawdust, ground straw, or cottonseed during the worst shortages. During the siege of Leningrad, which lasted from September 1941 to January 1944, the bread ration fell to as little as 125 grams per day for non-workers, and even this meager portion contained only 50% actual flour. The rest consisted of cellulose, cotton seed cake, and other fillers that provided bulk but minimal nutrition. Yet black bread represented life itself in Soviet consciousness. The queues that formed before dawn at bakeries in Moscow, Leningrad, and every provincial city became the daily ritual that structured existence. Women stood for hours in temperatures that froze exposed skin in minutes, clutching ration cards that determined whether their families would eat that day. The Soviet state had collectivized agriculture in the 1930s under Stalin's brutal transformation of the countryside, destroying the kulak class and consolidating grain production under state control. This system, designed to extract maximum resources from the peasantry to fuel industrialization, proved catastrophically vulnerable to disruption. When war came and the Wehrmacht occupied Ukraine, the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, the entire population faced the consequences of a centralized food system with no redundancy and no private reserves. Cabbage in its fermented form as sauerkraut provided the second pillar of winter survival, and its importance cannot be overstated in understanding how Soviet citizens endured months without fresh vegetables. The fermentation process, which Soviet families performed each autumn in massive quantities, transformed fresh cabbage into a stable, vitamin-rich food that could survive in root cellars and unheated storage rooms throughout the winter. The vitamin C content prevented scurvy, the bacterial cultures aided digestion, and the sheer volume that could be produced from a relatively small garden plot made sauerkraut indispensable. In the communal apartments that housed Soviet urban workers, the annual cabbage salting became a collective enterprise involving entire floors of residence. Women would gather in courtyards with enormous barrels, shredding hundreds of kilograms of cabbage with specialized cutters, mixing it with salt and caraway seeds, then packing it tightly to ferment. The process drew on centuries of Russian peasant tradition, predating the Soviet system by generations, but the communal apartment structure gave it new social dimensions. During the war years, when fresh vegetables vanished entirely from state stores for months at a time, sauerkraut provided the only source of vitamins for millions. The Soviet medical establishment, aware of historical instances of scurvy in Russian winters, actively promoted sauerkraut consumption through public health campaigns. Though by 1942, such campaigns were unnecessary as the population needed no encouragement to preserve whatever food they could obtain. Potatoes represented the third essential element, and the Soviet Union's relationship with this tuber reveals much about the state's agricultural priorities and failures. Introduced to Russia under Catherine the Great in the 18th century, potatoes had become the primary caloric staple for the peasantry by the early 20th century. The Soviet state encouraged potato cultivation on private plots, even during the height of collectivization, recognizing that this crop could be grown on marginal land and stored in simple earth cellars through the winter. Each family in rural areas, and many urban workers with access to dacha plots, would harvest hundreds of kilograms of potatoes in autumn, storing them in cellars where the earth's insulation kept temperatures just above freezing. During the war, potato cultivation on every available scrap of land became a survival imperative. Parks in Moscow and Leningrad were dug up and planted with potatoes. Factory workers received small plots near their workplaces. The nutritional value of potatoes, providing both calories and essential vitamins when other foods disappeared, made them irreplaceable. In besieged Leningrad, when the official rations fell below subsistence levels, families survived by eating potato peels, extracting every possible calorie from tubers that in peacetime would have been considered inedible. The Soviet state's decision to allow private potato plots, even when private agriculture was otherwise suppressed, represented a pragmatic acknowledgement that centralized distribution could not meet basic needs during winter months when transportation networks froze and fuel for distribution became scarce. Buckwheat kasha formed the fourth component of winter survival, a grain that occupied a unique place in Russian and Soviet food culture. Unlike wheat or rye, buckwheat could be grown in poor soil and harsh climates, making it ideal for the Soviet Union's northern regions. The grain stores indefinitely when kept dry and cold, and its preparation requires minimal fuel, an important consideration when firewood and coal were rationed. Buckwheat porridge, cooked with water or milk when available, provided a filling meal that sustained workers through 12-hour factory shifts in unheated plants. The Soviet state maintained strategic reserves of buckwheat precisely because of its storage properties and the population's familiarity with its preparation. During the war, when the Wehrmacht's advance threatened grain supplies, the evacuation of food stocks to the east included massive quantities of buckwheat. In the Ural mountain factories where Soviet industry relocated during 1941 and 1942, workers building the tanks and aircraft that would eventually turn the tide of war subsisted largely on buckwheat kasha, black bread, and tea. The monotony of this diet, repeated day after day through winters that lasted from October to April, represented a form of suffering that left no physical scars but marked an entire generation psychologically. Soviet citizens who survived those years would speak decades later of never wanting to see buckwheat again. Yet, they fed it to their own children because the lessons of survival through winter had been burned into collective memory. Salted fish, particularly herring, provided essential protein and fats that sustained Soviet citizens when meat became unavailable or unaffordable. The Soviet Union's vast coastlines and inland seas, especially the Baltic, White Sea, and Caspian, produced enormous quantities of fish that could be preserved through salting and smoking. Herring, caught in massive quantities by Soviet fishing fleets, arrived in cities packed in barrels of brine, sold by weight at state stores. The fish required soaking before consumption to remove excess salt, then could be eaten with bread and potatoes to create a complete meal. The omega-3 fatty acids in herring provided crucial nutrition during winter months when fresh foods disappeared, though Soviet nutritionists of the era did not understand the biochemistry in modern terms. They knew empirically that populations consuming fish through winter remained healthier than those without access to this resource. The Soviet state's investment in fishing infrastructure, including the development of factory ships that could process catches at sea, reflected strategic thinking about food security that extended beyond agriculture. During the war, when livestock herds were slaughtered or fell into German hands, fish became the primary protein source for much of the civilian population. In Leningrad during the siege, ice fishing on the frozen Neva River and Lake Ladoga provided a supplement to starvation rations, with desperate citizens cutting holes through ice and sitting for hours in killing cold to catch anything edible. Sunflower seeds and the oil extracted from them constituted another crucial element of Soviet winter nutrition, particularly in Ukraine and southern Russia, where sunflowers grew extensively. The Soviet state promoted sunflower cultivation as part of its agricultural industrialization, building processing plants that extracted oil for cooking, while the remaining seed cake fed livestock or was processed into protein supplements. Sunflower oil, with its high caloric density and stability at low temperatures, became the primary cooking fat for most Soviet families. Raw sunflower seeds, roasted and salted, provided a snack food that delivered calories, protein, and essential fats in a form that required no preparation and could be carried in pockets for consumption during long workdays. The tradition of eating sunflower seeds, cracking them with teeth and spitting out shells, became deeply embedded in Soviet social culture, visible on street corners and in parks throughout the warmer months, and stored for winter consumption. During the war years, when the Wehrmacht occupied Ukraine's sunflower-growing regions, the loss of this oil source created a crisis in Soviet kitchens. The state attempted to substitute other oils, including whale oil and fish oil, but these alternatives proved less suitable for cooking and were often rancid by the time they reached consumers. The recovery of sunflower oil production after the liberation of Ukraine in 1943 and 1944 marked a tangible improvement in diet that signaled to the population that survival had transitioned to something approaching normalcy. Preserved meat, when available, took the form of salt pork, smoked sausages, and canned products that could survive months in cold storage. The Soviet state's meat production, collectivized under Stalin's agricultural policies, never met demand even in peacetime. And during winter months, fresh meat virtually disappeared from state stores, except for the privileged party elite. Working-class families who managed to acquire pork in autumn would preserve it through salting and smoking, creating products that could be shaved thin and added to soups or eaten with bread. The fat from these preserved meats provided crucial calories during winter, when physical labor in cold conditions demanded enormous energy expenditure. Soviet factory workers in Siberian plants, where temperatures remained below freezing for 6 months, required upwards of 4,000 calories daily just to maintain body weight. And fat provided the most efficient source of this energy. The state's inability to provide adequate meat rations, even during peacetime, created a parallel economy of private livestock keeping that persisted despite official discouragement. Rural families who maintained a pig or chickens on their private plots could barter preserved meat for other necessities, creating informal networks of exchange that the state tolerated because the alternative was widespread malnutrition. During the siege of Leningrad, when all conventional meat sources were exhausted, the population turned to alternatives that included dogs, cats, rats, and ultimately, in documented cases, human flesh. The breakdown of food distribution in that city revealed what happened when the Soviet system's inherent vulnerabilities met military catastrophe. And the memory of that breakdown influenced Soviet food policy for decades afterward. Root vegetables beyond potatoes, including beets, turnips, and carrots, provided variety and essential nutrients when stored properly through winter months. Soviet families with access to garden plots cultivated these vegetables intensively, harvesting them before the first hard freeze and storing them in cellars packed with sand or straw to prevent freezing. Beets, which could be eaten raw, boiled, or fermented into borscht, contained sugars that provided energy and a taste of sweetness in otherwise monotonous diets. The deep red borscht that became synonymous with Russian and Ukrainian cuisine served as a practical solution to winter nutrition, combining beets, cabbage, potatoes, and whatever meat or fat could be spared into a soup that could feed a family for days. The soup could be frozen in blocks and reheated as needed, and it actually improved in flavor after freezing and thawing. Soviet cookbooks published during the 1930s and 40s devoted extensive sections to preservation techniques and winter cooking, reflecting the state's awareness that survival through winter required knowledge transmission. These cookbooks, distributed through workplaces and schools, taught urban workers who had migrated from rural areas how to preserve food using traditional methods their peasant grandparents would have known. The rapid industrialization and urbanization of the Soviet Union during the 1930s had created a generation of city dwellers who lacked basic survival skills, and the state attempted to fill this knowledge gap through educational campaigns. When war came and the educated urban population faced starvation, many lacked the practical knowledge to maximize nutrition from available resources, contributing to the catastrophic death tolls in besieged cities. Dried mushrooms represented a crucial protein and flavor source that Soviet citizens gathered from forests during autumn months and preserved for winter consumption. The vast forests of Russia, Siberia, and the Western republics produced dozens of edible mushroom species that could be dried, creating a lightweight, shelf-stable food that reconstituted in water for soups and stews. Mushroom gathering became a cultural practice that combined recreation, food acquisition, and connection to pre-Soviet traditions that the state could not entirely suppress. Families would spend weekends during late summer and autumn in forests, gathering mushrooms that they would string on threads and hang to dry in kitchens or attics. The knowledge of which mushrooms were safe to eat and which were poisonous passed from generation to generation, and mistakes could be fatal. During the war, when protein sources became scarce, mushroom gathering intensified, with people venturing into forests near front lines to collect anything edible. The nutritional value of dried mushrooms, while lower than meat, provided essential amino acids and a savory flavor that made otherwise bland grain porridges palatable. Soviet cuisine's extensive use of mushrooms in traditional dishes reflected this historical dependence on forest resources during winter months when agricultural production ceased. Tea, while not food in the strict sense, deserves inclusion because of its central role in Soviet winter survival and social cohesion. The Soviet Union imported enormous quantities of tea from Georgia and other southern regions, and the state ensured that tea remained available even when other foods disappeared. The ritual of drinking hot tea, often without sugar or milk during shortage periods, provided warmth, a sense of normalcy, and a social framework for enduring hardship. Soviet workers would gather around samovars in factories during breaks, drinking glass after glass of strong black tea that helped them endure shifts in unheated buildings. The psychological importance of tea in maintaining morale during winter cannot be quantified, but appears repeatedly in memoirs and oral histories from the period. During the Leningrad siege, when residents burned furniture for heat and ate wallpaper paste for calories, the ability to brew tea from melted snow represented a connection to civilized life that helped people maintain the will to survive. The Soviet state's decision to prioritize tea distribution, even when more nutritionally important foods were unavailable, reflected an understanding that survival required psychological as well as physical sustenance. The foods that sustained Soviet people through winter were not chosen from abundance, but from necessity, shaped by climate, agricultural systems designed for extraction rather than resilience, and the catastrophic disruptions of war. The centralized planning that characterized the Soviet economy created a food distribution system with no capacity to respond to local needs or sudden shocks. When the system functioned, it provided basic nutrition to a vast population spread across the largest country on Earth. When it failed, as during the Ukrainian famine of 1932 to 1933 or the siege of Leningrad, millions died. The foods that became traditional winter staples represented the minimum necessary for survival, preserved through methods that required no refrigeration or complex technology. The knowledge of how to preserve cabbage, store potatoes, dry mushrooms, and smoke fish constituted survival skills that the Soviet state both relied upon and sought to make unnecessary through modernization. This contradiction between traditional survival methods and socialist modernization never resolved itself during the Soviet period. Even as the state built food processing plants and expanded agricultural production, individual families continued to maintain garden plots, preserve their own food, and rely on informal networks of exchange that operated outside official channels. The legacy of this winter survival culture persists in the former Soviet states decades after the USSR's collapse in 1991. Markets in Moscow, Kiev, and Almaty still sell pickled vegetables, smoked fish, and dried mushrooms, using methods unchanged from the Soviet period. The dacha culture, where urban families maintain small country houses with garden plots, continues to provide a significant portion of household food consumption. The psychological impact of generations who experienced genuine hunger during winter months created a cultural imperative to maintain food reserves that persists even when supermarkets offer year-round abundance. This generational trauma, transmitted from grandparents who survived the war to children and grandchildren who never experienced food shortage, manifests in behaviors that seem irrational in modern contexts. The compulsion to preserve food even when preservation is unnecessary, the inability to waste even spoiled food, the anxiety that accompanies winter regardless of actual food security. The Soviet system's failure to provide reliable nutrition created survival mechanisms that outlasted the system itself, embedded in cultural practices and psychological patterns that define post-Soviet societies. Understanding what Soviet people ate to survive winter reveals not just historical diet, but the fundamental relationship between totalitarian systems, environmental extremes, and human adaptation under conditions that tested the limits of endurance.